A young police officer pepper-sprayed a black boy just because he happened to be near the scene of a petty theft. He didn't ask questions. He didn't check his identity. He just acted. But minutes later, he came face to face with the one person he never should have messed with. It was a quiet fall afternoon in a middle-class Milwaukee neighborhood. Jalen Rivers, 12, coasted along the sidewalk on his bike, a faded backpack bouncing on his shoulders, humming to himself with no real destination, just the park a few blocks down. He pulled over in front of a corner convenience store, hopped off his bike, and parked it near the door. Inside, Officer Cole Mercer stood beside the counter, listening to the store owner describe a petty theft. The details were vague. Someone had grabbed snacks and run. A second-hand witness added only this: black kid, hoodie, maybe green or blue. It was far from precise, but Mercer's attention locked in. As the owner kept talking, Mercer glanced out the large front window. His eyes narrowed. Jalen was outside, adjusting his bike lock, wearing a blue hoodie. That was enough. Mercer didn't ask the owner to confirm. He didn't check timestamps or camera footage. He just reached down, unhooked the pepper spray from his belt, and stepped toward the door. Jalen was still facing the store, unaware. Mercer pushed the door open. His pace quickened. His grip tightened. He had already made up his mind. He didn't plan to ask questions. Mercer shoved the door open and stepped onto the sidewalk, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. Without hesitation, he strode directly toward Jalen. "Hey, where do you think you're running off to, kid?" Mercer barked sharply, his voice authoritative, demanding attention. Jalen turned, startled, his expression quickly shifting from confusion to worry. He raised his hands instinctively, palms out in an innocent gesture. "I wasn't—" Before Jalen could finish, Mercer lifted the pepper spray, aiming it directly into the boy's face. He pressed down without hesitation. Jalen's shriek pierced the quiet street. He stumbled backward, hands clutching at his eyes as the pain tore through him, the burning sensation overwhelming. His legs gave out beneath him, and he crashed to the pavement, crying uncontrollably. Mercer didn't pause or show any reaction to the boy's obvious pain. Instead, he swiftly grabbed Jalen's upper arm, pulling him roughly to his feet. Jalen struggled, half-blinded and gasping, but Mercer tightened his grip, ignoring the child's desperate sobs. "You're coming with me," Mercer said coldly, forcing Jalen forward. "My bike, please." Jalen managed between choked sobs, but Mercer paid him no attention, pushing the boy toward the waiting patrol car parked at the curb. He opened the rear door roughly and shoved Jalen inside, slamming it shut with a resonating bang. Jalen slumped in the back seat, eyes swollen, breathing ragged. Mercer walked calmly around the front of the patrol car, ignoring the bike lying abandoned on the sidewalk, wheels still spinning slowly. He climbed into the driver's seat, glancing briefly at Jalen through the rearview mirror with cold indifference. Without a word, he started the engine and drove off. At the station, Mercer parked the car and quickly exited. Opening the back door, he pulled Jalen roughly from the seat. The boy stumbled onto the pavement, still gasping in pain. Mercer held him firmly by the arm, leading him rapidly inside. The bustling station quieted slightly as officers glanced briefly, then deliberately looked away. Mercer steered Jalen down a narrow hallway, stopping abruptly at a small, windowless interrogation room. He opened the metal door and pushed Jalen inside. Jalen staggered forward, nearly falling, catching himself against a small metal chair in the room's center. Mercer followed, closing the door with deliberate force behind him. Without speaking, Mercer left briefly, returning moments later, holding a damp cloth. Jalen, still blinded by tears and residue from the spray, barely had time to react before Mercer roughly grabbed his chin. "Stay still," Mercer ordered sharply, scrubbing at Jalen's face with harsh, mechanical movements. Jalen winced, trying weakly to pull away from the aggressive motions. "Please, it hurts," he whimpered. Mercer continued silently, his expression void of compassion, only stopping once satisfied. He dropped the cloth onto the table and pulled the chair out sharply. "Sit," Mercer commanded. Jalen, trembling and hesitant, complied immediately, gripping the chair's edges for support. Mercer leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "All right, let's cut the act. What exactly did you steal from that store?" Jalen shook his head frantically, tears streaming down his face again, though less from pain than genuine fear and confusion. I didn't steal anything," Jalen stammered, voice weak, eyes pleading. "I swear, I was just buying water, I didn't—" Mercer scoffed, interrupting with a bitter laugh. "You think I haven't heard that before?" Mercer said dismissively. He leaned even closer, voice dripping with disdain. "Every single one of you kids thinks you're smarter than us. But you're not fooling anybody." Jalen's breath quickened in panic, his eyes wide and desperate. I really didn't." Mercer slammed his palm on the table, startling Jalen into silence. "Stop lying," he snapped, voice raised sharply. "You were right there, fitting the description exactly. You were running off. Why run if you've got nothing to hide, huh?" Jalen trembled, speechless, trying to find words that would convince Mercer. "Please, you got the wrong person. I promise." Mercer stepped back, folding his arms, shaking his head with exaggerated disappointment. "You know what's the problem. We've gone way too easy on kids like you," he said, voice calm but edged with menace. "Always giving the benefit of the doubt. Look around. This is what we get." Mercer leaned closer again, voice lowering, dripping with scorn. "You think I'm stupid, kid? You think you can just walk away from this because you cry a little?" Jalen shook his head silently, no longer able to speak clearly through his tears. Mercer watched him coldly for a long moment, letting silence fill the small room, increasing the weight of his intimidation. He moved again, slowly pacing back and forth in front of Jalen, maintaining steady eye contact. "Here's how it works. You tell me what you took, we wrap this up, and everyone goes home. You keep lying to my face? Well, it'll be a very long, very unpleasant day for you." Jalen swallowed hard, visibly shaking, unable to speak clearly, paralyzed by fear. Mercer's patience wore thin, voice turning sharp once more. "Talk, now." Jalen opened his mouth, but no words emerged, only gasps and quiet sobs. Mercer glared, frustration boiling over. He stepped closer, hand gripping the table tightly, voice dangerously quiet. "I'm going to ask you one last time. What did you steal from the store?" Jalen sobbed harder, unable to form any coherent reply. Mercer leaned in aggressively, anger flaring openly now. "You're going to regret wasting my time. You've got exactly 5 seconds to start talking." Mercer's threats were abruptly cut off as the metal door swung open sharply, banging against the wall with authority. Standing in the doorway, expression unreadable and gaze firmly fixed on the scene, was Senior Officer Keller. Mercer froze immediately, mouth half open, caught mid-sentence. He straightened up quickly, clearly caught off guard. Keller's presence dominated the small room, instantly shifting the atmosphere. Keller's eyes scanned the room carefully, from Mercer's clenched fists on the table to Jalen's terrified, tear-streaked face. He stepped fully into the interrogation room, voice low, controlled, but unmistakably powerful. "What exactly is going on here, Mercer?" Mercer opened his mouth, but no immediate response came. Jalen looked toward Keller, eyes wide with hope and fear, uncertain of what might happen next. Keller stepped forward, awaiting an explanation, his quiet presence amplifying the tension filling the small interrogation room. Senior Officer Keller stood motionless for a moment, eyes moving carefully from Mercer's tense stance to Jalen's tear-streaked, frightened face. Jalen remained frozen, eyes wide, his breathing shallow and uneven. Keller stepped slowly toward the table, examining the red blotches across Jalen's swollen face. Pepper spray residue still visibly marked the boy's cheeks and eyelids. Keller's brow furrowed sharply as he turned to face Mercer directly. "What exactly is going on here, Mercer?" Keller's tone was measured, but carried unmistakable authority. Mercer straightened quickly, clearly caught off guard, but attempting to regain his composure. "Suspect apprehended for petty theft, sir," Mercer stated confidently, adjusting his posture defensively. "Matched the description precisely. Black kid, hoodie, fled the scene. Wasn't cooperating." Keller's gaze shifted briefly back to Jalen, who continued trembling silently, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The senior officer's frown deepened slightly. "Did you get an actual name, officer?" Keller asked curtly, his voice deliberately neutral, betraying none of his thoughts yet. Mercer hesitated briefly, then answered firmly, still trying to project confidence. "Jalen Rivers." The name hung heavily in the small room. Keller's expression shifted abruptly, his eyes narrowing. He stepped closer to Jalen, scrutinizing his features closely, as if confirming his suspicions. Jalen flinched slightly, but remained otherwise motionless, eyes downcast, breathing unevenly. Keller's demeanor changed noticeably, something Mercer quickly recognized, though he couldn't immediately grasp why. Keller turned abruptly, reaching into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. He spoke quietly but urgently, voice tightly controlled, gaze fixed firmly on Mercer. "Get me Chief Rivers, immediately." Mercer's eyes widened at the mention of Chief Rivers. His posture stiffened, uncertainty replacing his former bravado. He glanced quickly at Jalen, realization slowly dawning upon him, dread visibly spreading across his features. His mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged. Keller ended the call swiftly, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He said nothing further, standing between Mercer and Jalen with deliberate intention, a quiet but powerful barrier of authority. Minutes ticked by, slowly in tense silence. Mercer shifted uneasily, adjusting his weight from one foot to the other, eyes frequently darting toward the door. Jalen sat rigidly, still gripping the edge of the chair, breathing shallow, hesitant glances toward Keller, unsure of what to expect. The heavy metal door suddenly swung open, banging slightly against the adjacent wall. Chief Darius Rivers stepped swiftly into the interrogation room, dressed in civilian clothes, expression dark and unreadable. The atmosphere tightened immediately, tension palpable as the chief took measured steps forward, pausing briefly to take in the unsettling scene before him. Chief Rivers' eyes quickly settled on his son, visibly distressed and clearly injured. His jaw tightened briefly, but he remained silent, maintaining professional composure. He approached Jalen slowly and deliberately, his steady gaze focused entirely on his son's condition. Jalen lifted his head slowly, meeting his father's steady gaze, eyes filled with relief and lingering fear. Without a word, Chief Rivers stepped close, carefully wrapping his arms around his son, holding him protectively. Jalen leaned into his father's embrace, shoulders shaking slightly with quiet sobs he struggled to control. The chief pulled back slightly, inspecting Jalen's reddened eyes, then carefully brushed his son's shoulder reassuringly, communicating without words. Jalen nodded faintly, visibly relaxing for the first time since entering the room. Chief Rivers turned slowly to face Mercer, his movements controlled and deliberate. Mercer's breathing quickened noticeably, anxiety clearly visible now. His previous confidence completely evaporated, leaving only confusion and dread. Mercer quickly straightened himself, trying to appear respectful, clearly struggling under the chief's silent scrutiny. Chief Rivers' voice was calm, low, yet unmistakably filled with controlled anger. "Officer Mercer, I need you to clearly explain what happened here. Now." Mercer hesitated, clearing his throat nervously. He glanced quickly at Keller, seeking support, but Keller's gaze offered no comfort or assistance. "Sir," Mercer began cautiously, voice strained. "There was a theft reported. Suspect described was a young black male, hoodie. I saw the boy, Jalen, outside the store. He fit the description. I detained him for questioning." Chief Rivers' eyes narrowed subtly, clearly unconvinced. He stepped closer, gaze unwavering, voice cold and precise. "Did you confirm the boy's identity? Did you confirm if he even entered the store?" Mercer swallowed hard, hesitating, struggling to maintain eye contact. "No, sir, not specifically. He matched—" Chief Rivers sharply interrupted him, voice harsh, leaving no room for further justification. "He matched what exactly, officer? A vague description of a black child near the scene? Was that enough for you to assault a 12-year-old? Mercer faltered visibly, his face draining of color, as Chief Rivers continued without pausing. "You pepper-sprayed my son without verifying identity, without evidence, without cause." Mercer's mouth moved silently, no coherent response emerging. His posture slumped, clearly recognizing the severity of his error. He glanced again at Keller, but Keller remained silent and neutral, providing no escape. Chief Rivers turned back briefly toward Jalen, whose eyes were fixed firmly downward, embarrassment and fear mixed openly on his face. The chief stepped toward Keller calmly. "Keller, have you reviewed Mercer's initial report or any evidence from the store confirming Jalen's involvement?" Keller shook his head firmly. "No, Chief. Mercer apprehended him solely based on a general description. No further verification." Chief Rivers nodded slowly, processing the information carefully, eyes returning sharply to Mercer. "Officer Mercer," he said, voice dangerously calm, "do you realize the consequences of your actions today?" Mercer struggled visibly, nodding weakly, but unable to form words. Realization fully dawned upon him now, the severity clear, consequences imminent. Chief Rivers continued without softening his stance, voice decisive and commanding. "This incident is unacceptable and will require thorough internal review. Until further notice, you're to remain off active duty." Mercer visibly recoiled, the full weight of the chief's declaration hitting hard. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but thought better of it, remaining silent, defeated. Chief Rivers turned away abruptly, walking back toward Jalen, placing a reassuring hand gently on his son's shoulder. Mercer stood frozen in stunned silence, understanding fully now how deeply he'd misjudged the situation. Chief Rivers slowly turned toward Mercer, his eyes fixed and unwavering. "You didn't ask his name," he said calmly, his voice quiet but authoritative. "You didn't check his ID. You saw the color of his skin, and that was enough." Mercer shifted his weight, visibly uncomfortable. His gaze briefly dropped to the floor before lifting again to meet the chief's eyes. "He matched the description," Mercer stammered weakly, attempting to defend himself. His voice lacked the earlier confidence, now tinged with desperation. "I followed standard—" Chief Rivers sharply raised his hand, interrupting Mercer immediately. "Standard procedure?" the chief echoed, a hint of anger seeping into his voice. "The only description you had was black boy. That alone justified attacking a child." Mercer swallowed audibly, a nervous movement clearly seen by everyone in the small room. His voice lowered, almost apologetic. "I didn't intend—" "Didn't intend?" Chief Rivers snapped firmly, cutting Mercer off again. His voice rose slightly, a rare show of restrained anger. "Yet you did exactly that. Just like before, Officer Mercer. Exactly like before." The chief turned abruptly, his gaze falling sharply onto Keller. "Keller," Chief Rivers commanded, voice steady, decisive. I want Mercer's entire disciplinary file on my desk by tomorrow morning. Every incident, every complaint, every interaction he's ever had. Everything." Keller gave a brisk, respectful nod, understanding the gravity of the situation immediately. "Yes, sir." Mercer's face turned visibly pale, realizing the full implications of the chief's order. He tried to speak, his voice shaking, struggling to maintain some semblance of dignity. "Chief Rivers, please." The chief silenced him with a single, cold glance. Mercer's eyes flickered desperately toward Jalen, searching for some kind of reprieve or explanation. Jalen sat quietly, eyes red and swollen, hands gripping the edges of his chair tightly. Mercer took a hesitant step toward the boy, his voice breaking slightly with strained urgency. "Why didn't you say your father was the chief?" Mercer asked, his tone almost accusing, as though Jalen were somehow responsible for his own suffering. Jalen slowly raised his head, looking Mercer directly in the eyes for the first time since entering the room. The fear had diminished slightly, replaced now with cautious clarity. He spoke quietly, but his words cut sharply into the silence. "If I told you who my dad was, would you have treated me differently?" The words resonated deeply within the small interrogation room, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Mercer opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words emerged. His eyes shifted away uncomfortably, clearly struggling to find a justification. Chief Rivers stood perfectly still, the weight of his son's words sinking deeply into the atmosphere. Keller remained quiet, eyes carefully observing Mercer's reaction. Mercer finally lowered his gaze, shoulders visibly slumping, overwhelmed by the stark truth of Jalen's simple question. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint hum of distant conversation from elsewhere in the station. No one moved. The tension in the room remained thick and oppressive. Chief Rivers eventually took a careful step toward Mercer, voice lowering into a stern, controlled tone. "You know exactly why you're speechless right now," he stated quietly. "Because my son just exposed the real problem. You weren't following procedure. You weren't enforcing the law. You acted purely on prejudice, on assumptions." Mercer raised his head slightly, attempting to meet the chief's stern gaze, but immediately averted his eyes again. His earlier arrogance had vanished completely, replaced with shame and fear of the consequences. "Your badge doesn't give you power to judge people based on appearances," Chief Rivers continued firmly. "Especially not children. This isn't just about today. It's about a pattern, and we both know it." Keller remained silent but watched carefully, understanding the broader implications of the chief's statement. Jalen sat quietly, absorbing his father's words with quiet pride, though exhaustion remained evident on his face. Chief Rivers turned back to Jalen briefly, placing a comforting hand gently onto his son's shoulder. "We'll talk more later, Jalen," he said softly, reassuringly. Jalen nodded weakly, eyes still focused downward. Chief Rivers faced Mercer once more, his tone leaving no doubt about the finality of his words. "Your suspension begins now," the chief said decisively. "I suggest you leave this room and take a long, hard look at yourself and the choices you've made." Mercer hesitated for a moment, clearly uncertain about what to do next. Finally, without another word, he stepped backward, turning slowly toward the door. Keller stood aside silently, allowing Mercer to pass. Mercer opened the door and stepped out, his footsteps fading down the hallway, echoing quietly in the uncomfortable stillness left behind. The chief watched Mercer leave, then turned calmly to Keller. "Make sure that file is complete," Chief Rivers repeated, voice calm but firm, making his expectations unmistakably clear. "Yes, Chief," Keller responded respectfully. Chief Rivers turned his attention back to Jalen, whose eyes were downcast again, his breathing finally beginning to steady. "You okay?" Chief Rivers asked gently, voice softer than before. Jalen nodded slowly, whispering softly, "I'll be fine." Chief Rivers squeezed his son's shoulder gently, offering silent reassurance. The room remained quiet, the weight of the confrontation lingering palpably. Keller stood respectfully aside, quietly observing the moment shared between father and son. The scene was both a private and powerful reminder of the underlying realities the confrontation had revealed. The room held its silence, the seriousness of Jalen's question still clearly resonating. Mercer's absence was palpable, the gravity of the consequences evident in the silence that remained. No further words were spoken immediately. The chief remained standing by his son's side, providing quiet support and reassurance, as Keller discreetly watched the powerful display of familial solidarity and quiet strength. The door remained closed. The only sound was the gentle hum of ventilation, the quiet breathing of the room's occupants, and the subtle ticking of the clock overhead, marking time as the reality of Mercer's actions and their implications settled deeply over everyone present. Darius placed a gentle hand on Jalen's shoulder, squeezing reassuringly. "You did the right thing, Jay," he said firmly. "You taught them a lesson without ever having to raise your voice." Jalen lifted his eyes briefly, meeting his father's calm, steady gaze. He nodded slowly, managing a faint smile despite his exhaustion. Darius guided his son toward the exit, their footsteps echoing quietly down the corridor of the station, leaving behind a silent room and an unspoken promise of change. As they stepped outside, Darius looked ahead with determination, his voice firm, yet reflective. "If even the son of a police chief can be treated like this, imagine all the children out there who have no one to protect them. If you believe justice shouldn't depend on skin color or status, share this story. Comment below if you've ever witnessed injustice like this. And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard.